Well, I want to thank all of you for being here as well and for your faithfulness year after year. And also thank you for those who are just worshiping for the first time today. We're blessed by your presence as well. Thank you for the mass choir and for the puppets and all the music and ministry and people who are helping to make this day a wonderful day of celebrating the Lord. And remember, we have a church picnic. So please, if you're going to leave, come on back after the second service and join us for lunch. Well, reading from Joshua, the first chapter. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. I'll give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Don't turn from it either to the left or to the right, that you may be successful wherever you go. Don't let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. Have I not told you? Be strong and courageous. Don't be terrified. Don't be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. A couple of years ago, Randy Sarksina invited me to spend the weekend with his dad at a home they had rented on the edge of a North Dakota duck marsh. Never having been there before, I plugged the address into my new GPS and I headed off. The GPS led me to the freeway and then to a 2-lane road and then a gravel road and finally to 2 tracks through a field where in the middle of nowhere, the GPS voice cheerfully announced, "You have reached your destination." Yeah, if I was a buffalo. There wasn't a building to be seen for 5 miles. And since I'd lost cell phone coverage 30 miles before that, I couldn't call for better directions. Well, with a lot of prayer and driving and door knocking, I finally found the house about 8 miles from where the GPS said it was. It was mistaken about the location. Anybody ever have trouble with a GPS like that? Yeah. Well, GPSs aren't the only ones to be mistaken about their location. The Bible is filled with stories about mistaken locations. The most famous being the 40 years the people wandered in the desert when Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt. The old joke is that they wandered in the desert so long because Moses was a guy and he refused to stop and ask for directions. But the real reason is that the people were afraid. When they sent out scouts to check out the promised land, they saw only problems and difficulties ahead of them. They imagined giants. In Moses' farewell speech in the final chapter of Deuteronomy, he reminds the people of how they reacted. He says, "But you were unwilling to go forward. You rebelled against the command of the Lord. You grumbled in your tents and said, 'The Lord hates us.' So he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where can we go? Our brothers have made us lose heart. They say these people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large with walls that go up to the sky." Such are the people's fears. Then I, Moses, said to you, "Don't be terrified, don't be afraid. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you as he did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes, and in the desert. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you, as a father carries his child, all the way you went until you've reached this place." Now that'll preach on Father's Day. As a father carries his child, so God carries you all the way. But they didn't see it. They couldn't see that God was carrying them. And because of that, they were afraid. And they imagined problems bigger than their God. They wanted to go back. They wanted to go back to what they knew. They wanted to go home. But Egypt was no home. Egypt was slavery. They were mistaken about the location. Their home was in the promised land. And God would lead them home, carry them home, like a father carries his child. They thought in Egypt they had reached their destination, but they were mistaken. God had much more promised to them if they'd only go forward. But they didn't. In their fear and grumbling, they turned away. And Moses led them for another 40 years, but they wandered around in circles out in the desert until once again they were on the edge of the promised land. Now, I don't want to compare myself to Moses in any way. I crossed the waters on a canoe, not walking on dry land. And I am fortunately not dead, even though the puppet kind of keeled over at the end. But Moses did die. I'm no Moses. But as hard as it is, after 13 years to say goodbye, imagine if it had been 40. Imagine all those people who have known no other leader but Moses. And now Moses gives them his farewell speech. And he leaves them to go off and die, never to set foot in the promised land himself. Imagine the people's grief. Imagine everyone who wanted to just stop, who couldn't imagine going on without Moses, who felt like their best days were over, who looked back on those days wandering in the wilderness with Moses and said, those were the days. It'll never be quite as good again. Why don't we just stop? But they were mistaken about their location. Their best days were not behind them, but ahead of them, because God had a plan. God had a promise. And Moses in the wilderness in those 40 years were part of that plan. But God wasn't finished with them yet. There was a promised land waiting. They weren't home yet. And so God brings them Joshua, a new leader. And what does God tell them? The same thing Moses told them. Be strong and courageous. Don't be terrified. Don't be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Folks, when I think about those words, I think about my going. My going off to do what seems to be an impossible job, mentor and care for 90 churches scattered across half of the state of Minnesota. I don't really know all that I'll be doing because, as is so often the case, I won't be trained for another 2 months yet. So please pray for those poor churches that will have to put up with me learning on the job. I'll be in a different church every Sunday, worshiping with people there and meeting with them throughout the week. It's all kind of scary. But I know that no matter where I go in northern Minnesota, that God will go with me. But notice that these words aren't given to Moses as he goes off. These are given to Joshua and the people Moses has left behind. The people who are still called to go forward and enter the promised land, even if Moses can't go with them. The best is yet to be. God has a plan for them. The promised land is still waiting. And you know how much I love you and how much I love this church. I've never been to a church that has been blessed with so many gifted, creative, Christ-led people. This is a unique church. And you're willing to step out and try new things. Just look at our worship. Who could have imagined puppets and chimes and all the many choirs happening every month. Those of you who have been here for longer than I, you can remember back to 13 years ago. We didn't have all that in our services, or the children's time, or the screens, or 2 full services. We didn't have those, but you stepped out and tried something new. You tried something new on Wednesday nights, and we have Wednesday night ministries. And we have Boundary Waters ministries, and we have parts of the building where we're doing so many ministries in that we didn't have 13 years ago. Now, some things we tried for a season, and then we moved on. The services in Andover, the men's group, different forms of confirmation class. We tried things, we experimented. But in all these things, you listened to God and moved forward. And God was there wherever we went, carrying us as a father carries his child in his arms. But we're not home yet. This is a great church, but God has something greater yet in store. And as long as half the people around us in the cities don't know Christ and don't have a relationship with a community that can lift them up and support them, a community of faith, as long as there are people in need, not only in our community, but in communities across the world that Christ is calling us to respond to in his name, then we aren't home yet. In fact, we won't be there until Christ comes again. So often we get mistaken about our location. We haven't reached our destination yet, not as a church, not as individuals, not as a world. This isn't the promised land, as good as it may seem. The best is yet to be. God isn't finished with us, not any of us. So in the meantime, while we wait for Christ to return or for Christ to take us home, let us be faithful, not fearful, courageous, not cowardly, patient and forgiving of each other, slow to grumble and to listen to words about imaginary giants, and quick to give thanks and to share words of hope and encouragement, to build up our brothers and sisters so they can be the best that they can be, and to make this church even better than it's ever been. I'm so thankful for having the privilege to serve Christ with you these past 13 years. And I can't wait to see the amazing new things that God has in store for us in the future. God has much more promised. We ain't home yet. So be strong and courageous. Don't be terrified. Don't be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And until we meet again at the feet of Jesus, God be with you. Thank you. Amen.